All right, hey guys, we are back finally. Episode 9 of the Complete Strength Podcast. Took a few weeks off, and so now back today. Jon Hereth from Some Rehab is joining again, and we're going to talk about ACL injuries, specifically in female athletes, but ACL injuries in general, because they are, if you have daughters who have played sports, if you are a female athlete, or maybe even just a woman in general, women tend to be more prone to ACL tears than men do. So I think most of us have had someone close to us, or if not yourself, experience an ACL tear. I know Sydney has, for example, so she's gone through that. I mean, and Jon,
I've had both.
You've had both, so that doesn't it's definitely not limited to female athletes. We're not saying that, but it is more prevalent. So we want to get into that a little bit with this today. So, Jon, you started off with, we were just trying to pull up some statistics here to try to at least give it a little bit of an idea.
I think we were saying they do roughly between 100,000 and 200,000 ACL repairs a year across the nation, which is a lot. And a majority of those are happening in young high school and collegiate athletes. And then I think when we were kind of still looking to it, they said that female athletes tend to occur this injury at rates 2 to 10 times higher than their male counterparts. So it's definitely one of the most significant injuries that an athlete can go through. Oftentimes it's career ending. The rehab is intensive. I think a couple years ago we all watched Adrian Peterson come back from his ACL tear, and he came back pretty much at a world record pace for coming back from an ACL.
I think his was like 8 months.
It was
9 months.
It was six to 7, and that was mind-blowingly fast. Back to full 100%.
Yeah.
Whereas with most people, it takes at least back to what would be considered normal, closer to a year.
Yeah, and a lot of times we see it in the pro athletes or college athletes. I think the pro athletes, it's usually kind of like they come back the next year. It's a real rebuilding year. Then 2 years, they're back to fully 100% as far as playing. A lot of times you see even that first year back.
It's kind of like a rebuilding.
They're kind of rebuilding, retrying to
Carson
do it.
Wentz this year.
Yeah, just trying to figure out how to play again and how to do it.
Well, and a lot of that's too is because with that with that time spent rehabbing, and we'll get into this a little bit later, they lose so much of their capacity that even though they're healed and released, they're not up to the athletic par that they needed to be up to, usually to compete in their sport.
Yep. So some of the general statistics in female athletes in particular, let's talk about why is it so prevalent? What do you see over the years, and just see in general, why is it so prevalent for the female athletes and just female versus males in particular?
Well, I think there's a lot of research that has been done on that, because it's a question that we think we have answers to, but nobody knows the full answer to, and so we just keep researching it. There's a bunch of different components to that. I think a big global component, one of the reasons we're seeing ACL tears more is because we're specializing in sport more and earlier, and now we have, instead of having a 12-year-old who plays 3 sports and has a summer break, we're seeing a 12-year-old that plays 1 sport year-round and travels. And so we're specializing sooner. I think that's a big component of it. I think we kind of subscribe to a more is better philosophy. So if instead of practicing 6 hours a week and then training on top of that, well, why don't we practice 10 hours a week and train 10 hours a week? And because more is better. When watch Rocky or Remember the Titans to figure that out. And then I think with females specifically, there's been lots of suggestion that cyclical hormones play a big role into that. How females are built, their hips tend to be a little bit wider, which increases Q angle, which can put more stress on the knee joint. And females also typically, not always, but typically tend to be a little bit more anteverted in their hips. which will cause more hip internal rotation, especially if it's not controlled. And so I think there's a whole host of components that make females maybe a little bit more vulnerable to.
Explain two of those for our people listening that don't really know exactly what we're talking about. The Q angle, and then you're talking about the hip anteversion, and then some of those things.
So Q angle just means when you have wider hips, your knees will come together more. Essentially,
being that relatively relative the hip to knee angle
yep.
of where you see instead of coming more straight down, hips being wider.
And we all have that, but females relative to their height have a larger angle than males do. And then hip anteversion just means that our hips tend to sit a little bit more forward in the sockets. And when that happens, we tend to internally rotate our femurs a little bit more. We have more capacity for internal rotation. And if we can't control that, we will crash into knee valgus or the knees will knock inwards and uncontrolled. That's a recipe for an ACL tear.
Yeah, it's a big recipe for that. We were just talking before we started. We're trying to see some of the stats for the trends because I want to see if I'm curious to know if any stats or if the history is showing that it's trending upward, ACL tears in female athletes, or if it's trending downward, or if it's staying relatively the same.
I think as of now, last thing I read, it's still continuing to trend upwards. Like this is still a problem,
which is disappointing.
Well, and I think
for the past 20 years.
My personal opinion is, we've had way more awareness about this. We specialize all over the country in ACL prevention programs, et cetera, and I think all of that's helpful. But I think again, this is my opinion, but I think a big component of it is athletes are just doing too much, or too much of the wrong thing at least, and not enough of the right thing, which is part of what we'll talk about. Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely concerning
that it's concerning that it's still trending upward. Yeah. I think definitely because we've like we talked about before. I've been doing this for 10 years, and a little over 10 years now, and it was going on way before that. I mean, the 20 years, 25 years, or whatever now, we've been seeing the increased rate of ACL injuries and tears in these female high school and collegiate and professional athletes. It's a little disappointing, and I don't know if it's disturbing, but it's disappointing that it's still trending upward.
Well, especially
after all these years, with all the technology and with all the research and with all the stuff that we have.
Well, I think with what we know now, if you look at the research that has been done on ACL prevention programs, depending on which research you read, we can prevent non-contact tears at anywhere from the low end is 30% to the high end is like 90%. Even at the low end, that's 30% of the tears that aren't happening because of what we're doing in the prevention world, and that's significant.
Yeah.
So we can definitely do better, and I think the big components of it is having educated trainers, coaches, and healthcare professionals that understand the components of why ACL tears, especially non-contact.
Non-contact.
I'm referring, when I say ACL tears, I'm referring to non-contact tears. There's not a whole lot you can do about a linebacker crashing into your knee.
Yeah.
But non-contact ACL tears, we understanding the mechanisms of injury and how managing training and managing movement plays into that. If I can go into that, there's two components to somebody tearing their ACL. The first is, what's their movement quality look like? Are we repetitively putting undue stress on the knee joint because we move poorly at our knees, or we move in this case probably pretty poorly at our hips and our ankle? And are we addressing that movement quality issue, or are we just continuing to strengthen that dysfunction? I think that's a big component of it. That's something that we do over in the clinic a lot, and something that we try to address with the ACL prevention programs that we give is it doesn't matter how your programming is going or what you're doing if your quality is terrible.
Yes.
And making sure, people know how to load their feet right. If your foot pronates and you have a huge navicular drop, the chances of you tearing your ACL go way up because of the mechanics of how you load that knee joint. If you have we touched on this earlier, if you have a ton of hip internal rotation passively, but you don't have good active control of that hip internal rotation, the chances of you falling into that knee valgus position under when you're fatigued or under high intense situations or under a lot of load, the chances of you managing those positions well goes down, and that leads to ACL tear. So I think movement quality is a big component of it. And then I think a big underappreciated component, especially kind of globally across all the disciplines, healthcare, training, coaches, even how parents interact with their high school athletes, is movement capacity, right? Are we doing too much? And I actually just read a good book by Mike Isertil. You and I were talking about that earlier, where he talks about how much should we train, maximum recoverable volume, and how often we exceed with our training and with our sport specific skills, our practice, how we often exceed what we can recover from. And when we do that repetitively, that fatigue accumulates, and at some point that'll end catastrophically.
Also disappointed.
Yes.
I'm also very disappointed
because those are all
where we are
components. Those are all components that if you educate yourself, if you educate your athletes, if you educate other trainers and other healthcare providers, they're all manageable. Mm-hmm. And you can't prevent every ACL tear, but man, we can manage them better.
Yeah.
And for all the technology out there, a lot of times it's just knowing the science and being smart with how we structure practices, how we structure training programs, and then looking at movement and making sure people aren't moving like crap.
That's good. We want to make sure people aren't moving like crap. That's a good bonus. That's something that we've always been trying to do on the training side, is we're trying to teach our athletes how to land properly. We were just talking about box jumps. It's so wildly popular, obviously, in all kinds of training circles and settings, but we want to focus as much, if not more, on how our athletes land on the box and how they come off the box as we do how they get up on the box. If they can jump up on a 90-inch box, great. But are they landing on their toes? Are they landing with their knees together? Are they landing with their feet turned out so those knees are in that collapsed valgus position? Sure. Are they landing with their knees way up above their hips? So now they're pulling their pelvis under in an unnecessary position, and all those things. Like that's what you're talking about. The training quality, I think, can still be a big part of it, so that maybe we can't on any individual level, the team sport coaches don't have a lot of control over the training programs or outside training that they get, just like strength coaches and trainers don't have a lot of control over what they do in practice or the practice competitive schedule. So we're kind of just trying to do each little part to try to put it all together. But
I think at the very basic level, you have to ask yourself when you're dealing with an athlete, at each individual joint, can this joint get in the position to absorb and adapt to stress? Because that's the whole idea behind training, right? Is we absorb stress and then we adapt to it, and we get our desired gains or results from those adaptations.
Gains with an S or gains with a Z?
With a Z. Okay. There is no other kind of gains. Okay. And we get stronger. But if we're not putting ourselves in good positions to absorb and adapt to stress, at some point that stress will have a cumulative effect and break. And so, working with somebody that knows, hey, this is a better position. that we can absorb stress better, making sure that, especially with a lot of explosive athletes use speed to hide a lot of deficiencies a lot. And so they'll not be able to decelerate very well or control eccentric movements very well. And they'll hide it really well because they're strong and explosive. So making sure we can break down those components of movement as well and say, hey, maybe you can bounce out of the bottom of a squat with 400 pounds, but can you pause squat with your body weight?
Right.
And like it's almost kind of laughable, but I see it all the time. And so asking yourself, can I get this joint in a position to absorb and adapt to stress, and then loading it appropriately, right? One of the things I talk to you about with the athletes that we see over in the clinic and with their parents is stress is cumulative, and I tell parents especially, it's imagine you have a bucket, right? And they practice 6 hours a week. Well, that's a cup in the bucket, a cup of water in the bucket. And then, they have 6 finals that week. That's another 2 cups of water in the bucket. And then we go to a personal trainer 3 times a week, and that's more water in the bucket. And at some point, if we don't manage what we put into that bucket, or if we don't manage that stress and do a good job of going to sleep on time, not having our phone in bed at night, or all these other things that we can do, eating well to manage recovery, at some point you can only fill your stress bucket so much, and it's going to overflow, which in this sense, in this analogy, looks like overtraining, which eventually leads to injury. Judging off the high school kids that we see, I mean, these kids don't sleep more than 4 to 5 hours a night anyway, so we know that they're probably chronically under-recovered. They're probably training too much, especially when you look at the volume of competitive practices. They don't eat very well, typically. And so all of that, plus poor movement mechanics because of how we're built or how we're taught, will lead to be a recipe for disaster. And it's all very manageable at the, like what we talked about, at the coach level, at the trainer level, at the healthcare professional level. But ultimately, the parents and the athlete have to take responsibility for this as well.
That's a good point. This is slightly unrelated, but it just makes me think of even this morning when Will was in here. Will's a college baseball player here for the break, and we're trying to do this might not even make sense or go along with what we're talking about, but it's a point that he has his training schedule with the school and for his program, and so he's on a Monday, Wednesday, Thursday lifting routine, and he had a fracture in his foot, and he's coming off injury, trying to get back up to speed going into the spring season when he goes back, and so he wanted to work on some of that extra, call it speed work, but basically doing some resisted sprinting and getting back to some sprinting and just some load with that to see if he's doing that. So we're going to do that on the off days on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And so I told him, like, we'll have to monitor it. We'll try it, but I want to see if you can recover after your lifting day on Monday, then we'll try it. Well, here it is Tuesday morning. Killed it yesterday with squats and glutes and jumps and all this stuff. So he's today trying to warm up, and he's like, man, my hamstrings are sore, and just moving just with probably 75% of his just overall performance capacity just in just his body movement.
Sure.
And so for him, I was just like, we're going to do it tomorrow.
Well,
shut it down for today. Just relax a little bit, do a little bit of stretching, a little bit, try and accelerate the recovery a little bit that way. Let's do a little soft tissue. Just try and just relax today, and then we'll double up tomorrow, do our speed work before your lifting work. We'll offset it like morning, afternoon, that way. And it was that's an example. I don't even know if that made sense to you or anybody else, but that's where we have to monitor the athlete to see if that it's not going to be productive today. And it's probably going to lead to injury.
Yeah, it's probably going to be counterproductive.
It's most likely going to be counterproductive. So,
well, and I think that's a great example, and I've got a couple points to make to that. I think first off, exactly what you just did was right. He wasn't recovered.
Yeah.
And if you're not recovered and you add additional stress, you're not going to get any good adaptations. You're just going to continue to degrade because of the stress. I mean, which again, at some point is going to lead to injury.
Yeah.
I think that's point number one. I think point number two is we have to remember that everybody manages training volume or manages stress differently. Some people can go super hard every single day and be great. Some people can go hard once a week and then have to pitter patter the rest of the week because they just don't recover well. And if they go above that, they'll get to the point of diminishing returns. So it's very, very individualized. And then the third point I wanted to make is you mentioned that he's coming off a foot fracture, heel fracture, you said. We have to remember that when we're dealing with injury, especially back to the ACLs, there's a big difference between being released medically and being at your best in terms of recovering from high intensity performance workouts. And that's something I think the healthcare community can do better on too, because all the times people ask, well, when am I released? When can I return to play? True. And I think maybe a better term, I'm going to steal this from the clinical athlete guys, is return to training as opposed to return to play. Because even when you're cleared medically, that doesn't mean you have the fitness or the capacity to do what you need to do as an athlete. And I think there still needs to be a working period of building that capacity, building your strength, because otherwise what's going to happen is you're just going to overload too quickly and you're going to get hurt again. And we see that with athletes all the time. They get better, they crush it, and they probably go back too fast and then get hurt within those first three to 4 months again. And so I think that's definitely a good point.
I think, and that's just what we were talking about, where you mentioned with we met throughout names like Carson Wentz and those guys we've seen in the NFL like this year. It's like, okay, they're released, but maybe they're not fully back to sport yet. I think it's more of a two-part process. They're medically cleared and released, but I think it's the two-part process saying is right on, where it's released. Okay, now you're cleared to return to training. And then part two, after that, then you're ready to return to sport fully.
Well, and a lot of these,
process.
Especially ACL rehab, it's hard. These athletes work, but there'd be no reason even if you didn't get hurt, if you just sat on the couch for 6 months and then got up, you wouldn't be in sport shape.
Yeah.
And nobody would assume that. Well, typically when you're done rehabbing an injury, you're still not in sport shape. Now, that's not to take away, people work really, really, really hard in their rehab, but it's still not the same as training.
Yeah.
And we still typically are healing. We still have capacity limitations. Maybe we even have actual tissue limitations. And so I tend to think, and I'm guilty of this with my own rehab, having competed in strength sports and having hurting everything ever. I let my ego go too much and return probably quicker than I should. And as we get older, we get wiser.
We get
hopefully
we get gray hairs in our beards. That makes us wiser.
I don't think I have any.
Guaranteed.
You do.
You don't?
I don't think I do.
I'm older than you. We've been kind of touching on this a little bit, but maybe not. How does, maybe you've already talked about this, but how does PT help or maybe even hurt the problem at all? And then I'll kind of talk about and we can both talk about how does, on the performance training side, how can that help / hurt?
I think whether you're dealing with prevention or whether you're dealing with the aftermath of a injury or in this case an ACL reconstruction, having the performance side and the rehab side on the same continuum, speaking the same language, understanding what the goals are, makes the process so much better. Oftentimes you deal with healthcare professionals that don't understand the demands of sport or training, and then they release the athlete because they're medically cleared and
the tissue quality looks good,
right? But are no way prepared for training or even ready to be released to training at that point. And then on the flip side, oftentimes in the performance world, we see that more is better attitude, and they don't understand how to manage training programs or manage loads or teach movement quality very well, and the people that have the genetics for it flourish, and then everybody else kind of gets hurt. And so, assuming you didn't win the genetic lottery, paying attention to that stuff and making sure you work with a trainer, a healthcare provider that understands that streamlined process is huge, I think.
Yeah. And also, I want to mention specifically on the training side of, some people might, maybe a question that we get, I'm sure we have gotten it or we get it often is, well, what do we do to try and help prevent ACL tears? And I'll just mention a few things. We've been talking like more holistically, how do we create a better culture of managing stress, not filling up that bucket with too much stress because it's going to overflow, lead to injury or overtraining, but on some of the specific things, thinking about like primarily with our younger female athletes, getting them a foundation of, we talked about box jumps, but how to obviously squat properly in our feet more of a forward position, opening the knees so they're not collapsed, and be able to externally rotate at the hip, to have good posture, or having good control of the posture in the pelvis and the knees, the ankles, the feet, and then in our single leg landings, our single leg exercises, doing pistol squats, split squats, lunges, step ups, trying to re-emphasize that pattern of the knee is a little more on the outer side of the foot or outside the ankle, with the foot down straight, with the toe down, the heel down, externally rotating at the hip. I think those things, like those are some of the specifics that we're trying to work on in the training world that we need to continue to do, so that when the point and the goal being, when they get to sport, when they get to practice, they compete, they can cut on one leg and that knee doesn't collapse in that valgus position because they've worked on it. The muscle memory is there.
And they can absorb
they understand.
And adapt to
Understand. They can absorb and adapt to that stress because they've been working on it in a good position and in the proper way. So that's where some of those things we try to work on specifically to try and help the girls.
I think if we go from global to specific, probably the best thing, at least with the athletes I see, one of the best things, and it's easy: sleep more.
That's totally.
If you're not getting at least 8 hours of sleep as an athlete, you could be doing better. Probably closer to 10 hours would be better. And again, everybody's a little bit different, and some people actually only need 5-6 hours of sleep to function well. You're probably not one of those persons. So sleep more. It's easy. Get off your phone. Turn the TV off. Sleep more. If you really care about being an athlete, sleeping more will do way more for you than anything you can buy at GNC. I think after that, the other big global component is just have a smart training program, right? A smart training program, working with somebody that knows how to manage stress and manage loads, and that's injury prevention. Training smart is going to prevent injuries, whereas not training smart is probably going to cause injuries. I think those are the big two global components that are super easy. And then, like you mentioned, we getting into the specifics of when we are training. Are we moving well? Or is our exercise selection intelligent? Are we structuring our sets and our reps well? Are we making sure that, like this is going to be a little bit repetitive because you touched on this, but are we creating a short foot? Can we, when we land a jump or when we decelerate a cut, can we absorb that stress, especially with our adaptive tissues, as opposed to absorbing stress with joints, or absorbing that stress passively? I know we talk about active and passive loading strategies quite a bit, but I think doing that in terms of prevention, and we teach a dynamic warm up as a prevention tool, and part of it's to get the kids warmed up, because when things are warmed up, your brain's working better, and the chances of you loading poorly are less. But a big part of the dynamic warm up is just to get these kids into movement patterns, and have them do these big global movement patterns well, repetitively. because that's like what you mentioned with muscle memory and acquiring those skills is going to have a transfer effect when we're in competition.
Yeah. When you can't think about it
Right,
in a split
exactly.
second.
Yeah.
That's the idea. If you can think about it. I've been trying to find the study, because I remember Stanford University did a study a few years back about sleep, and they recommended 10 hours for their collegiate athletes to be able to perform at their optimal level.
Oh yeah.
And I think a lot of people, I'm trying to find something. This is basically just what it said. I mean, I'm trying to find here one now, the basketball team that they did it on, getting 11 members of the team to sleep at least 10 hours for over a 5 to 7 week period, and then tested and found improvements in their shooting accuracy, their sprint times, all those things. That is, and people, I remember when they come out, everybody's like, oh, well, that's impossible. Nobody can sleep 10 hours a night. Like these athletes, they're in college. They got to cram for study, and you got to stay up all night and do this. You got to, when you're looking at it, and you and I, we're both kind of like, come on, you need to manage your time better, I think. It's see what's important to you to be able to perform, or is it to
And honestly,
procrastinate?
if you get rid of electronics, if you turn the TV off
Yeah.
and turn the phone off, there's nothing else to do, so you'll go to sleep. And I mean, I'm guilty of that too. I'm on my phone in bed all the time. It's hard to disconnect, but if you're looking for simple things that you get a lot of bang for your buck, not obviously this is relevant to ACL tear prevention, but just performance as a whole. As an athlete, sleep more.
Yeah.
Because you can only train as hard as you can recover, and sleeping's the best recovery tool you have. Sleep more. Make sure your quality sleep is good.
Yeah.
Especially as a young athlete who's probably still growing. And kids, I say kids, even high school athletes need a lot of sleep, even when they're not training.
Yeah.
You add a training stress or sport stress to that, it just makes it even more so.
Yep. I concur, Doctor. I think we covered a lot of this stuff that we wanted to cover today, like PT and training programs should be mutually responsible. I think a lot of ways, like you talked about, we all need to be a little more, I don't know what the word is. It's cohesive, but we need to work together. Continue. It shouldn't be
Play nice.
Yeah, we need to be able to continue to work together. I think where if in our world, as far as complete strength goes, in the performance training, strength coach, blah blah blah, personal trainer world, if we're not focusing and if we don't have an understanding of what causes some of these injuries, how to prevent some of these injuries, at least on the base level, what can we do on the baseline? Like I don't think we're not providing good training just by. That's a whole separate podcast of quality training versus just training.
Well, and we need to remember too, we're
need to work
specifically referring to non-contact ACL tears,
Yes.
which
If you get
those are preventable.
If you get a high cleat on a tackle in a soccer game and it just hits right in the side of your knee and your foot's dug in the ground, it is what it is.
Something.
Yeah.
But not all injuries are preventable, but these certainly are.
There's a much higher percentage of that can be preventable. Yeah.
So to sum up, sleep more, train well, don't move like crap. ACL prevention 101.
ACL prevention 101. 3 steps. Follow these 3 simple steps. Isn't that what we want in our culture? Our society, we want 3 simple steps.
How to not tear your ACL.
We're gonna write that. That's gonna be a bestseller. We're gonna overtake Becca's book that she's doing on the nutrition side of 3 simple steps to preventing ACL tears.
Her book's probably gonna be a lot smarter than ours.
I guarantee that. Just talking to her on a podcast, she was 10 times smarter than I am. So that's good. That's a good thing. That's why people are on, because people don't want to hear just me talk all the time. Any final thoughts? Training, PT information. We covered a lot of stuff.
No, man, this was fun. It was good.
I like getting into some of the specifics. So I definitely like talking about some of the more specific topics too, because ACL injuries in female athletes is, like we talked about, it's still trending up. It's always prevalent, and it's year after year. We just see it all the time. Parents are all constantly asking about it. The girls are talking about it. What do? we need to be informed, but I think you're right on. We got 3 easy steps. Listen to this podcast, and you guys got it all figured out.
Awesome.
It's easy as that. Cool, man. Thanks for being on.
All right, thanks for having me again.
It's good stuff. All right, that is it for episode 9 of the Complete Strength Podcast. We'll be back next week and hopefully get back on track with these, and we'll be back with our 2-minute drill continuing next week as well. Thank you all for listening, and see you next time.